Okay, well, before I begin, I would just like to state for the record that today is July 14th, 2021, and my name is Ben Bauman, and I'm here in Indianapolis, Indiana, and I'm speaking via Zoom with Dr. Tony England. And where are you currently located?
In Superior Township, just east of Ann Arbor, Michigan.
Okay, perfect. And we are doing an interview for the Indiana Astronaut Oral History Project. So just starting off, when and where were you born?
In Indianapolis in May 15th, 1942,
All right,
Methodist Hospital.
perfect. Okay. And what were your parents' names?
Herman and Betty England.
Okay. Now, how long had your family been in Indiana?
A very long time. My grandfather on mom's side may have immigrated from Ireland. He was Irish. Bright red-headed fellow. I never met him. He passed away before I was born. Mom's side, the other side, or her, try it again, his wife was sort of Victorian English, and I don't know how far back their family goes before they immigrated. Dad's side is even foggier. He his relatives were down in the Appalachian area, and he once went down there to try to trace them to figure out his own background, and was met with somebody with a shotgun on a porch.
Oh my gosh.
decided he didn't really need to know.
Wow. That's crazy. Okay, yeah. And what were your parents' occupations?
Dad insured livestock transit, and mom worked often as a secretary or bookkeeper type thing. She only had a high school education, so she didn't have really a profession.
Right. Okay. Did you have any siblings growing up?
Yes, I have had two brothers and a sister. My youngest brother passed away when he was in his 50s from cancer. I still have another brother and sister.
Okay. So how would you describe your childhood?
Boy, that is an open question.
Yeah, it is.
I mean, it was a positive childhood for the period. There's no question. It's incidentally, let me present a couple of interesting things about my childhood. Later on, I'll explain that I grew up in North Dakota and had a childhood sweetheart up there. We met at 15 and eventually married at 20, and we were married for 51 years before she passed away from Alzheimer's in 2013. But across the street from where we lived in Indianapolis, we lived on Hyatt Street in West Indianapolis, which is not very far west, considering how much Indianapolis has grown. But the house that my grandfather was a carpenter, and he built our house as kind of a rooming house, and Grandma rented rooms in it as he rented it to my family before we were able to get a place of our own. And she rented room to a Ernie Mills, who eventually purchased a house across the street and had his own children, and had a child, Susan Mills, who is now my wife.
Wow. Okay. That's interesting.
That is interesting. Yes. Unfortunately, she's ill with cancer, and
Okay. Oh no. All right.
I'm her caregiver, so I may have to interrupt this occasionally.
Yeah.
But
No.
anyway,
No worries.
we got married in 2016, and it's been really great fun to have this common background and be able to finish each other's sentences and all of this kind of thing. Typical childhood. We were. I mean, I was probably getting in trouble a lot, but people like Ernie Mills, the fellow across the street, was entertained the boys of the neighborhood by the things he built. He eventually developed cabinet factory, and that was sort of his career. But he'd fly box kites at night with flashlights and
Wow.
gliders that we launched off roofs and jumped off roofs and all of the things you do when you're a kid. And so I consider my my childhood a positive thing. It was I didn't have some of the problems that a lot of people have, and
Yeah.
I thank my parents for that. I don't know where they got it. My grandfather was a railroader and was laid off during the Depression, and there was quite a turmoil in his family. Their parents broke up, and Grandpa had some traits that my folks kind of kept us away from him a lot.
Okay.
But anyway, Dad, I don't know where he got his ethos on what was right and what was wrong. It certainly didn't come from Grandpa.
Okay.
Maybe it came from Grandma. I don't know, but he was very positive about treating people equally and well, and so that was a very nice thing that I had through my whole childhood that maybe not everybody's had, and that was fortunate.
Yeah, sure. No, I totally understand. Yeah. So, who would you say was the most influential person in your childhood?
Many. I'm not sure most. One of the more influential ones was my mother's cousin. His name was Archie Sink, and grandmother on that side was the Sink family. And he was son of a farm family down in southern Indiana at the beginning of World War II. And he had moved up to Indianapolis and working in a factory packing dishes. But when World War II started, he enlisted and became a bomber pilot, flew B-25s, flew them over Europe. And towards the end of the war, he was shot down, and his crew got out, and he got out, but he got a lot of burns. His ears were burned down to nubs, and but he survived the parachuting and spent the end of the war in a German hospital. At the end of the war, that was a funny situation where if you wanted to leave the military as a pilot, you got more separation pay if you were grounded first. I don't understand the logic of that, but that's what it was. So he went up for his check ride to get grounded so that he could get out of the service with this more favorably, and found that he couldn't force himself to fly badly.
Yeah. Okay.
And so the instructor said, "You're going to have to do a lot worse if I'm going to flunk you." And at that point, he decided he was going to stay in. So I'll explain, when I was 12, my dad got transferred to run the Hartford office, which was livestock and farm insurance in Fargo, North Dakota. And so we moved up there when I was 12. And Archie used to fly planes still in the military, mostly C-47s and other cargo planes through Fargo. I couldn't fly in them, but he let me climb all over them. And then when I went to Air Force Flight School later, he actually came to my graduation. So he was somebody that had a significant influence on what I consider important.
Yeah, definitely. I bet that's really interesting. Okay. So what were your main interests as a child?
Oh, building stuff and exploring things, going places I shouldn't have been and getting in trouble.
Yeah.
that kind of thing. I didn't take schooling very seriously until junior high school in Fargo. When we first got up there, the first class, the first grade I was in Fargo was the 7th grade.
Right. Okay.
Actually, in the fifth grade, we had moved down by then down in the country south of Indianapolis to an area called Pleasant Valley. And I've forgotten the name of the consolidated school there, but in the fifth grade, they actually considered holding me back as a discipline problem. So, yeah,
Okay.
so I'm not exaggerating to say I was always getting
Wow.
in trouble.
Yeah. Okay. Fair
We
enough.
used down in the country there have to the shop class made paddles with holes in them so that knurled handles so that the instructor could get a good grip on the thing. And we boys, almost by our pride, had to do something in the week to every Friday, at least learn one whack. so that was school in Southern Indiana.
Yeah, a little bit different than today, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, right.
Now, what understanding, if any, did you have about outer space as a child?
Very little. I was not a science fiction reader and didn't
Yeah.
watch Buck Rogers and that kind of thing. For some reason, I really got interested in science in the seventh grade and seventh, eighth grade, and my grades rapidly improved for some reason. And I went to junior high in Fargo, and then we moved out to near the stockyards where Dad had his offices in West Fargo, which was actually a separate town of only about 3,500 people. And the high school was very much smaller than the junior high in Fargo. We only had 54 people in the senior class.
Wow.
So the choice of courses was much more limited. And for example, they only taught chemistry 1 year, and then the next year teach physics. They couldn't teach them the same year. And the school was small enough that we lost our science teacher after, I guess it would have been my freshman year there. And so they were only able to get an English teacher who had never had science in college to teach the chemistry and physics. Well, I took the physics my junior year, and because of the interest in science, I actually was able to help some in the class, not taking over the class or anything,
Right.
but often in demonstrations that I would actually do the physics demonstrations for the class.
Wow.
And I was an amateur radio operator at the time, so I was also building radios and stuff, and so I was pretty much into that kind of technology. But anyway, there weren't many courses left to take in the junior or in the senior year. So I persuaded the superintendent, a fellow named Berger, and he was another person that had a big effect on my life, because I asked if I could graduate a year early, because essentially tractor mechanics, I could have gotten chemistry, but to stay around a whole nother year, I'd had a whole year of typing. There was just not that much to take. And he actually arranged it so I could. And then people bet me, well, gee, if you're going to do that, you're not going to get into a good college. And I bet that I could. And it's because of that bet that I applied to MIT and Harvard and then backed up at the local university. And it turned out that MIT gave me a full ride. So it became the cheapest place to go. It's cheaper than the local university.
Sure. Yeah, of course.
So that's how I got into MIT.
Yeah, that's cool. Wow. And what schools did you attend in Indiana?
49 in East Indianapolis, then 82 in West Indianapolis, and then we moved down to the country to that consolidated school.
Okay, sure.
I don't know whether they still just go by numbers, but that's what they were.
I think it probably varies. Yeah, I'm not sure.
Yeah. My mother worked at Ellis Ayres downtown. I understand it's now gone, but it was a block off the Monument Square there. Sure, and where we were in West Indianapolis was actually close enough that I could ride my bike down and meet her downtown for lunch or something.
Wow.
Or Christmas shopping or something of the sort. Actually, I did the same thing riding. You probably can't do these things anymore, but this place we lived in the country was on off Route 37 as you go to the southwest towards Martinsville. And I rode the bike in several times from there, and it was actually beyond the county line road
Wow.
into Ayers to greet Mom.
Wow, that's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, no, it was much easier to get around in those days. I mean, it was nothing to when I was in West Indianapolis, they made all of we kids take 3 years of piano before, and then we could do anything with it we want, like quit, like I did. But when we were in West Indianapolis, I would take the bus to downtown and go to the Arthur Jordan College of Music. I don't know whether it's still there, but it was right next to the library on the east side of the library.
Yeah.
Kind of a what do they call it? Something iron, a wedge-shaped building.
Yeah.
Anyway,
I know. Yeah. Okay.
So I did that for 3 years.
Interesting. Okay. Wow.
Yeah.
And how would you describe your educational experiences overall from Indiana, then to
Well,
Dakota?
I didn't take it too seriously in Indiana, and for some reason completely changed in the junior year and took it very seriously after that. And it wasn't the quality of the schools; it was just somehow growing up.
Yeah.
The experience at MIT was an eye opener. MIT doesn't have any remedial courses. And here I hadn't had trigonometry or advanced algebra or chemistry, and everybody else, a lot of the other students had come from Bronx Science and Baltimore Polytech and other places. So my undergraduate years at MIT were, and I also was on a competitive scholarship, so they have a 5-point system, so I had to keep above a 4.5, which I barely did. I mean, just barely. And so, I mean, the freshman year, I considered, I calculated that I took one night off every 6 weeks from studying. And I would go through my meals fast and get back up to my room to get back to catching up, and developed an ulcer and everything else. But I learned a lot, but it wasn't much fun.
Yeah.
Graduate school there was fun. I enjoyed that. Somewhere, I guess, in my senior year, I knew they weren't going to kick me out if my grades fell. So I relaxed about, taking tests and things. And actually, my grades went up, which is the right way, because you're there studying for the material rather than studying for the grade. I just wasn't able to do that until then.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I guess it's just a process, especially coming in, behind in some of those subjects, not having taken those classes. So,
well, there's something they told us in the freshman year. We had 900 freshmen, and we were all in Kresge Auditorium during the introduction, and they said, if I can paraphrase it, something like, we could have filled this whole class with perfect 1,600 SATs. We didn't do that because we found there's another kind of student we call a striver. Now, a couple of hundred of you do have perfect SATs, but we tell you that you better take our program seriously here, because if you don't, those strivers will be eating your lunch by the junior year. And I think there's a lot of truth to that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. Competitive place. Yeah.
Well, they've softened it a little bit now, for the better. And I'm not saying it was better in the old days at all. It wasn't.
Right.
We were getting about 2 suicides a year there. And
oh my gosh.
What they do now is they give you grades the first year, but they don't record it in your GPA. The grades tell you how you're doing, but it gives you some catch-up time that you can begin to learn how the school works. Also, they much more influence students working together. And in my time, it was almost everybody was on their own. So it's much more a humane place. It's still richly tough, but the students I've talked there to, and that they like alumni to interview students who are being considered for admission. And the students that I talked to who are going, who are now being, acting as interviewers, don't describe it the same way I remember it.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Colleges, I guess, continue to evolve and change. So.
Yes.
Thinking again about your time in Indiana growing up, did you have any views about the state of Indiana or about being a Hoosier?
No, not much. I wasn't that aware of the world.
Okay. Yeah.
When I went someplace, it was usually someplace like the stockyard where Dad had his office. and
Fair enough.
And I worked on farms. And actually, the first year I went to North Dakota, we moved up in the spring, and I went back to Indiana. I think it was 12 when I was 12, and served as a farmhand on a farm near the place where we used to live. And they were friends of my parents through church.
Oh, okay.
And I needed a farmhand, and so I spent the summer driving tractors and haying and all that kind of stuff, which I really enjoyed. And they also opened a booth at the county fair, and so I got to flip hamburgers during the day there. And then in the evening, I could take the ones that hadn't been sold to the Carney show and trade them for tickets. So, and also that, at the county fairs, you have the tractor parade. So I got to drive different tractors, and that was always fun.
Yeah. Okay. That's cool. And what was your major at MIT?
I started out in physics, and I found that they were talking about high energy physics primarily in those days. And it was a little bit more abstract than I was comfortable with. Things were represented by an equation rather than a physical thing. And I was just uncomfortable with that. So I tried applied math for a semester, and there I found the students played math games every night. I didn't play math games, and I thought, I'm not going to be able to compete with these people. And so my senior year, I transferred into an honors a 5-year honors program in geosciences, which gave a bachelor and master at the end of 5 years. And that I really enjoyed, and particularly I liked the geophysics. I enjoyed that because geophysics was ball and spring physics, which I understood. And I liked getting out into nature so I could work in the field as much as I wanted to, and then work in the lab doing theoretical work as much as I wanted to. And it's worked out through my life really, really, really well.
Yeah, that's great. Were you involved in any clubs or organizations at MIT, or?
Not as an undergraduate. It was all work. It's interesting because, when I went to high school, I played football and was on the track team and head of the science club and all this kind of thing. So every year at MIT, they would interview you at the end of the year and look at your grades and all of this. And one of the things they do is, and what other activities have you done? None. So it was just work there until graduate school. And then in graduate school, you had research teams that worked together, and it was a much more humane,
a little bit more laid back, I guess,
and a lot more fun.
Yeah, that's good. In what ways in college did your interest in space grow, or maybe you did?
When I was in graduate school, I wrote a couple of papers on my research area was planetary interiors and how planets form or moons form. And I predicted, a joint paper with faculty, we predicted what the internal electrical structure of the moon would be. And this is important because the electrical structure is tied partly to composition, but more to temperature. So you can actually get a handle on the internal temperatures of the moon through its electrical structure. And you can test the electrical structure through its interaction with the magnetosheath of the Earth or through radar signals. Because the moon is so dry, it's essentially transparent to radar. So you can use radar, a fairly long wavelength radar, to sound down hundreds of kilometers.
Wow.
On the Earth, you can only do the same thing for maybe 10 kilometers, or not 10 kilometers, 10 meters.
Yeah.
10 meters, because the Earth is so wet. And we use seismic on Earth to sound, but that is not as good on the moon, because the moon's rubble parts rub together and absorb the sound. So acoustic doesn't go as far, but radar goes very far.
Interesting. Wow. Okay. So after you graduated from MIT and you went to grad school, also, what did you study in grad school? Was there a different specialization, or?
Well, I didn't know what I wanted to do for sure. And I was interested, looking at planetary interiors was very similar to solid state physics. And I had a very unenlightened idea of the state of solid state physics. Now, today, solid state physics is about where I thought it was back then. And we were going to be able to actually manufacture new materials and things, because they do that now, and they couldn't then. But anyway, so I married before my senior year, and so I was talking to Kathy about, well, it's usually better to go to another school for graduate school. It's generally considered good practice, but I do enjoy the geophysics here. So why don't I apply to geophysics graduate school here at MIT, and I'll apply to Caltech and material science. And I did that, and both schools made me the same offers. So I thought, well, it's better to go to another school. So I told Kathy in the morning, well, I'm going to go in and tell my advisor, thank him for my offer, for his offer, but I've decided to go to Caltech. And I knocked on his door, and he said, hey, good to see you. I just got a grant to study some structure in the Alps. Do you want to come with me? And I said, yeah. And I just came in to tell you I decided to stay here at MIT. So
wow.
that's how I stayed in geophysics.
Oh my gosh, that's interesting. So you're very close to leaving, but you ended up staying.
Yeah, well, my wife thought I was telling him I was going to leave, but
yeah.
And I'm glad I stayed. I've really enjoyed the geophysics. And as I said, material science wasn't nearly as far as I thought it was.
Yeah, okay, sure. So what was your plan then after graduating grad school?
I had assumed that I would stay in academia because I kind of liked the environment. And I had been rushed by some oil companies that actually flew me out to their home bases. And in the summertime, I particularly as an undergraduate, I explored for oil for Texaco for one summer, and was on a power line crew for Northern States Power on another summer, and worked in a cybernetics lab another summer. So these summer jobs had a lot to do with what I wanted to do, and I found that the research ones were the more interesting ones. So that's what I thought I was going to do. But then NASA started, advertising for scientist astronauts, and I thought, well, gee whiz, it'd sure be fun to go to the moon and carry out some of these experiments that I had been working on while I was at MIT. In fact, one of those experiments actually flew on Apollo 17, so I was a co-investigator on a experiment, electrical radar probing experiment that flew on Apollo 17. It was from work in the graduate school.
Yeah.
So anyway, I applied there were two groups that NASA really didn't want scientist astronauts. They wanted pilot astronauts. It was Harry Hess, who was a professor at Princeton, who was the head of the Space Studies Board. NASA, people don't often remember that even before Apollo 11, there was a lot of pressure to end the manned space program. It was just very expensive, and we were in Vietnam, and the civil rights disturbances were going on, and sort of a lot of people just didn't feel like we needed to be doing this space stuff. And so NASA was very sensitive to support from the National Academy of Sciences. And Harry Hess was able to say to NASA, if you don't take scientist astronauts to the moon and actually seriously explore the moon rather than doing it as a stunt, the National Academy will withdraw support for the Apollo program, and NASA couldn't afford that. So that's why they took the fourth group of astronauts was the first group of scientists. And that was, Jack Schmitt, who finally got to go to the moon, and Owen Garriott and Ed Gibson, who those went on each of the Skylabs. And then the NASA, the Academy again said, well, you don't have enough people, scientists, to go to, going to the moon yet, considering you're planning to go to 26 missions at that time. Yeah. So they were forced to take a sixth group of scientists, astronauts. So I applied, and they sent the applications to the National Academy to down select. And I sent something like 68 of them back to NASA. And then NASA had the 68 of us in groups of, I don't know, some smaller number, go to Brooks Aerospace for a week and then fly over to Houston to be interviewed by the astronauts. And that's how I got in.
Wow. Okay. That's interesting. And so was it a pretty competitive process then, going through like applying to NASA and everything else?
It was. And even when you got in the astronaut office, our first day on the job there, they put all of us, there were 11 of us, in a windowless room with a secretary sitting in the front like the head of a classroom. And Al Shepard, who was the head of the astronaut office at the time, came in and greeted us. He says, I hope you know that we didn't want you here, and that if you were smart, you would resign right now, but I don't suppose you will, so we'll press on from there. That was how we were introduced to the astronaut office. And so, the scientists were always in a position of proving their worth as an astronaut. And so, it was that old thing, if a pilot tells a joke, everybody laughs, but if a scientist told a joke, there was this stunning quietness.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
So it sounds like the NASA culture at the time was very much focused on just exploring, but not really research so much.
It wasn't even exploring. It was very much on technology development. Okay. They had a very difficult time telling the difference between an experiment and a demonstration. And it was one of the things that really, in the shuttle program, earned me probably a reputation for a big mouth, because I was always saying, we're doing the same thing and it's costing a lot of money. Can't we press the technology or something so that we learn something on these missions that help us on the next one? I mean, my mission in 1985 cost $750 million in $85. And there's almost nothing you can do on one mission, except maybe repair the Hubble, that is worth that kind of money. And yet we kept doing the same thing over and over again. And that's pretty much why I left NASA.
Okay. So it was just kind of a bunch of missions that didn't really have a whole lot of purpose, I guess.
No, they were disconnected just over and over again. And let's go back to Apollo. The Apollo, Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo program was very aggressively set up so that you learned something on every mission that allowed you to do more on the next mission. Mercury is pretty simple, man in a can, and then Gemini had rendezvous and all of this. And then with Apollo, you could actually go to the moon and actually land there. But NASA was very concerned that it wasn't that they really wanted to explore the moon. It was that they wanted to develop a technology that allowed exploring the moon. Okay. So when they thought they had that technology when they landed on Apollo 11, but they were kind of scared a little bit by the difficulty that through a mental block, Apollo 11 commander had in finding a good place to land. Remember, he hovered around and just about ran out of fuel before he landed. And so NASA said, this is a little more dangerous than we thought. What we would really like to do is fly it once more with Apollo 12 to prove it wasn't an accident. We could do this and then go on to the next program. Because if we lose a mission, we might lose all of our manned programs. This was a risk that they were arguing with. Meanwhile, the National Academy came back and said, no, look, you promised you were actually going to explore the moon. 2 landings in the Mare doesn't constitute exploring the moon. And you also promised you're going to fly scientist astronauts, and you haven't done that. So they cut back to 20 missions. That was where they were after Apollo 11 and the debate with the Academy. And then with Apollo 13, they got scared again and wanted to cut back, and the Academy again said no, but this time they cut back from 20 to 17. It wasn't to save money, because the 18, 19, and 20 were actually manufactured and built, ready to fly.
Mm-hmm.
And in my rotation, what we did is, excuse me, I'm getting dry here.
No worries, yeah.
I was tracked for Apollo, and some of the others in my scientist astronaut group, most of the others were tracked for the Skylabs, because there was going to be a second Skylab. And so I was, and they assigned 9 astronauts to a crew, 3 prime, 3 backup, hoping the prime got sick, and then 3 support who were sort of learning the trade, and they acted as the Capcoms during the mission. So I was the support crew for Apollo 13 in the Capcom. In fact, I was coming on the console when they called, Houston, we have a problem. And because I was called the mission scientist, because when they were to be on the moon, I was the Capcom that always was to talk to them when they were doing their EVAs.
Okay. Yeah.
But anyway, so that was Apollo 13. And 3 missions later, you move up. So I started as backup crew on Apollo 16, and then they canceled with the idea that I could have flown on 19. But when they canceled 18, 19, and 20, then I lost the place to go. And so they didn't want to go through teaching me to fly, particularly the landing module, because that's what that crewman does.
Yeah.
And so they took the prime crew from Apollo 13, made them the backup crew for Apollo 16, and bumped me back to the support crew for 16. Now, I wasn't bitter about that, because just being part of the Apollo program was such a privilege. And yeah. I liked the idea of training the Apollo 16 crew. They were a fine crew and great to work with, and became good observational geologists and did a fine job on the moon. So it was all a positive experience, just right. Wasn't what I'd hoped to happen. So anyway, after Apollo, we were going into about a decade of building this shuttle. And there wasn't much for a scientist to do at NASA. Their science office in the manned space program was particularly weak. And, it wasn't something I really wanted to do, waiting for the shuttle to fly. So I talked to John Young, who had been my boss on both Apollo 13 and 16. He was a backup commander on 13 and then the commander on Apollo 16. And said, well, look, I really enjoy this flying. I would like to go to test pilot school and then come back and join the piloting ranks, because the shuttle is going to need some test pilots in the early days. He thought that was a good idea. And so he said, go off, visit Edwards, excuse me, that's Air Force Edwards and the Navy's Pax River, and see which one you would like to join. Now, John was Navy, so he obviously had a favorite, but he wasn't going to push me one way or another.
Yeah,
I did. And at Edwards, the primary aircraft, they did a lot of stuff. They had Chuck Yeager there was running the program, and they had a very strong space access program, because the MAL, Manned Orbiting Lab, astronauts came out of there, and there was an idea that the military was going to have a manned space program. But there was already signs that the MAL program was being canceled. So, and Pax River, the Navy Test Pilot School, had 23 airplanes I could fly, and they also allowed me to be carrier qualified. And then they said, if you do our school's 8 months, if you stay another 8 months as a teacher, it'll cost NASA nothing. So this I thought was great. Went back to old Matt, said, John, that's what I wanted to do. He was all for it. And I was just a couple of couple of weeks from actually leaving Houston for Pax River when we scientists got cross-threaded with, what was his name? This old age stuff, these quick response
no
names
worries.
go away.
That's fine, I understand.
Yeah, well, anyway, he was the head of Johnson Space Center and real crusty individual. And NASA was arguing strongly for the shuttle program. This was at the end of Apollo, and they're very political. And so astronauts were going around with senators giving speeches on the value of shuttle. And the senators would say something like, "Oh, and we need the shuttle because the research we do with the shuttle up there is going to help us cure cancer." And then they would turn around and say, and Dr. England, isn't that true? And yeah, on all of the things. And we were promising 54 launches a year and all of the kinds of things that all of us knew were impossible. And so I wasn't the ringleader, but as a scientist astronaut, I joined the group and agreed with it. It wasn't that I was towed along, but the head of the titular head of our spokesman for the scientists was trying to tell Chris Kraft, that was the name, tell Chris Kraft that we were hurting ourselves by these exaggerations because eventually it would become clear that they weren't true and we would lose our credibility.
Yeah.
And Chris became furious. He hammered on his desk and he says, and the leader had said, "We feel like our integrity requires that we tell you this." And he pounded on his desk and I'm quoting, he said, "The problem with you scientists is you have too much integrity and not enough loyalty." At that point, he fired that giant scientist. He was gone. And he was going to transfer. He found out that I was going to go to test pilot school and told me, "We don't need any more pilots," and was going to send me over to the science group until the shuttle started flying. And I said, "I don't want any of that," and I quit.
Yeah.
So when I left NASA in 1972, I was not intending to go back. It was for us, a little bit of personal peeve.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I bet.
And I went to the U.S. Geological Survey in Denver and had a great time. I was doing airborne geophysics, and I had an otter and a beaver and a turbine porter at different times in my project. I could go any place in the U.S. that I wanted to carry out the kind of experiments I wanted to do. And I had an assistant that was helping. I published some papers that actually later, when I got into the University of Michigan as a faculty member, were the reason. If I hadn't had those, I wouldn't have been invited to come to Michigan. So, yeah. And the USGS, while it's a little bit of a sleepy outfit, has extremely high integrity. They have secret information or proprietary information, I should say, from the oil companies and mining companies on what their resources are. And in the time since the law had been passed, which was in the 1920s, that these companies had to share those resource information with the survey, there had never been a leak. There had never been anyone taking advantage of that. And that's just a sign of the integrity of the survey. So I was just delighted with working with them. I learned a lot, got some good science done. And then in 1979, John Young, who had become head of the astronaut office, called me and said, "Look, if you want to come on back and get your mission, then you can go back to do your science if you want. But if you're waiting longer, the line will get too long." So that's why I went back in 1979. The idea is, I'll get a mission and maybe in 3 years, I'll be back to doing my science. Well, it took me 9 years. The shuttle wasn't ready as I thought it was. I also had a big mouth. So, so some of the commanders in those early missions didn't want somebody with a big mouth. I think that was it. And then I finally flew on Challenger in 1985. That's 4 years after the shuttle started flying in 81. And it was a great mission. Gordy Fullerton, the commander, was had been a commander of heavy airplanes, so he knew how to work with a crew. A lot of the other astronauts' flying experience was in single pilot airplanes, and they didn't work with other people very well. Often the flights would come down, the people in it would be enemies. And but our crew was just great. We had a very challenging mission. Nobody raised their voice at each other, and it was just great. In fact, after the mission and we all left. Well, we had the Challenger accident shortly after our mission. I didn't want to leave right away because it looked like rats leaving a sinking ship. But once NASA started flying again, that's when I went to the University of Michigan in '88. But I never bothered going back to the astronaut office again. I'd had enough of that. But our crew was still good enough friends that we had reunions every few years and in really interesting places. And it was a delightful experience.
Yeah, that's really cool. Let's see. So yeah, you answered kind of a lot of questions there. I guess backtracking a little bit, can you describe what were you thinking when you first learned that you were going to be accepted to go to NASA?
Well, I don't know. I was just glad to go. My professor couldn't understand why I would do that, but anyway, I did. Yeah. It allowed me to put together two things that I love very much. Flying is one, and science, discovery kinds of science is another. And it's been the same my whole life. Here at the university, I gave up the flying for most of the time here, but now that I was approaching retirement, and I retired at the end of June, when I was approaching retirement, I bought a light airplane, and so I fly it out of Meditol whenever I can. And
oh wow,
yeah, I enjoy it very much. So in my retirement days, I decided I'm not going to do any more science. I, in fact, gave my books away.
Okay.
to keep myself from getting too wrapped up in that. And I've got a essentially what they call a lobster yacht, which makes it sound fancier than it is, but it's a 28-foot boat built on a lobster hull. I had it built in Maine and brought it back on the water, went around East River and around Manhattan and up the Hudson and down the Erie Canal and all this business. And anyway, so I love to use that for exploring on the Great Lakes, going up into Georgian Bay and North Channel and all the places north of Lake Huron. And then between the airplane and that lobster boat, I feel that, and my new rocking chair, I feel like I've got my retirement planned.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's good. See,
I didn't have it in mind that my wife would be sick, but that's just life at our age.
Yeah, sure. Now, I know you briefly mentioned it earlier, but could you describe a little bit more about your work on the Apollo program in terms of the mission that you're involved with?
As the scientist, the mission specialist in Apollo, not trying to get mixing terms. As the mission scientist on an Apollo mission, and that support crew role, my job was to help the crew get trained. So I would help with we would go to analogs on Earth of what we thought the crew was going to find on the moon, geologic analogs. So every 2 months we had them out on doing field work and learning field geology. I served in the simulators as the simulator Capcom. I act as the Capcom talking to the crew during their simulations. And then during the flight, I was the Capcom that was the interface between the science back room and the crews while they were on the surface of the moon on Apollo 16, and would have done the same thing on Apollo 13, but of course they didn't land on the moon. Yeah. I was coming on as the scientist for the lunar part of it. I didn't spend a lot of time on the dynamic flight part of it. So the Capcom work that I would do on the way out and on the way back was I would usually come on in the evening after they had done flight or the trajectory corrections and all of the burns and things that they do, and tuck them in and then sit there all night and then wake them up in the morning and then turn them over to another Capcom. So that was really what I was doing, and that's what I was doing. They had just done the translunar burn on Apollo 13, and I was coming on the Capcom console to take over from one of the pilots who was Capcom when they called Houston, we have a problem. And because my specialty was during EVAs, and I was a specialist to work in the suits, when the issue became the CO2 content in the landing module, which we were using as a lifeboat, remember, to get around. Remember, they couldn't stay in the command module because the batteries were running down and there was no oxygen for the fuel cells. So, and the LEM was only designed for 2 people at a time. And so with 3 people in there, they were using up the capacity to scrub the CO2. And so they had me go work with the crew system division to develop using suit components, a CO2 scrubber to assist the landing module in removing CO2 from the atmosphere. And I did that, and I wrote the procedures to the crew because I knew their language. And then I read those procedures to the backup crew in the simulator to see if they came up with the same scrubber. And when we were satisfied we had good procedures, then Joe Kerwin read the procedures up to the actual flight crew.
Wow. Okay. And so you were there when that problem was occurring on Apollo 13, and
oh yeah. In
fact, how much
there's
pressure did you feel in that situation to help get this problem solved?
One of the things that you learn in solving problems is not to worry about the pressure. You're dedicated to finding a solution, and you don't spend too much time with what ifs. It reminds me a little bit when one time when this summer I was exploring for oil in the Navajo Nation for Texaco. We worked 2 weeks, 9 days on and 5 days off, and lived in a field camp. And we were doing, as I said, seismic, and we were doing dynamite down the hole. And so you spread out 1/4 of a mile in each direction from the shot hole, these geophones, and then you fire the dynamite and then look at the reflections. One of the geophones had come loose from the cable up towards the end, and they said, yeah, Tony, take the dynamite truck and run up to the end. Well, the end was actually going up a grade into some small mountains, and the road it wasn't a drop off, but it was steep enough that the truck would have rollen over if it had gone down that slope.
Yeah, sure.
And the road was curving slightly. So anyway, I put the brakes on and stopped the whole thing and was out range. The geophone, I heard this crunch, crunch, crunch. And I looked back, the darn truck was starting to roll back down the hill, the dynamite truck. And it had probably, we were sometimes shooting up to 300 pounds in a hole. And so it probably had close to 1,000 pounds of dynamite on it. And if it had gone off that cliff or that edge, the caps were there too. And so this might not have had a good outcome. So I ran after it, got in the truck. Well, the engine was dead. So I didn't have power brakes and I didn't have power steering. So I couldn't get it stopped, but I could, force it back as it backed up down the hill until it reaches some flat area. And, this is just what I did. And it wasn't until after it was over that I actually had to get out and sit on the ground, considering how this might not have worked out so well. And that's kind of the way it is when you have a flight problem, is you jump on the problem to try to solve it. It's just like on our shuttle flight, we lost an engine on the way to orbit. And we had to do what was called an abort to orbit. We passed the point where 2 engines could get us to orbit. And then a little bit later on, about 6.5 minutes into powered flight, we had a second engine indicate an overtemp, and this one we would have had to manually shut down, but we hadn't reached what was called single engine press. We couldn't make it to orbit on the remaining engine, and we'd overshot rate of Spain. We were high enough. So the only if we had shut down that other engine, we'd have had to ditch the shuttle at night in the Mediterranean, and which is not a very good outcome.
Yeah.
And if we didn't shut it down and it really was an over temp, it would have blown the tail off in about 15 seconds. So there was a 15-second interval there where Boost made a decision and told Flight to have us override the shutdown, that she had seen a similar failure at the Michoud test facility. And so they told us to do that, and we overrode it and made it to orbit. But,
Wow.
at the time when that's going on, you're not thinking about, this doesn't seem like a good situation. What you're thinking about is, okay, what do I do next? What is my responsibility in this situation? Well, I was responsible we had 2 payload specialists on board. And during ascent, I was responsible for their health. So I was figuring out, well, how do I manage them? And if we have to ditch, what do I have to do? So that's what was going through my mind, not, oh, this is a bad situation.
Yeah. Wow. So, okay. So you were involved in some pretty interesting things then with NASA, with Apollo 13 going on and helping that crew, and then on your own journey on the Space Shuttle, having a precision problem.
We were not flying the shuttle safety in those early days, and we knew it. We had 3 missions of what were called open paper, meaning discrepancies that we couldn't explain. And we were trying to tell Washington that we needed to stand down and figure out some things about the shuttle. And they were so concerned about the politics if we'd done that they wouldn't let us do it. When we lost the Challenger and that following spring, none of us were surprised. We were just angry because, our words were, the bastards finally got us.
Yeah. Yes, just so it sounds like, obviously, because it is a government agency, there is an enormous amount of politics involved.
Well, the shuttle was a fantastic engineering achievement. It really was.
Yeah.
But it was a bad solution. It was a bad engineering solution, and the shuttle design and what it was all political.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting.
And you notice that the follow-on vehicles don't look very much like the shuttle.
Yeah, I think that's right. Things have changed. Yeah. Thinking about when you started to become and prepare to become an astronaut for your space shuttle mission, what training did you have to go through to prepare for that?
Well, in Apollo, they didn't want us, and they didn't really know what to do with us, and they thought of us as pipe smoking, wearing jackets with pads at our elbows, professor types.
Okay.
And so they wanted to partly to weed us out, and partly because they thought we needed the training. We went to water survival school and Navy underwater school and jungle survival school in Panama, and desert survival school in Eastern Washington State, and ditching survival school, and then they wanted to send us to the Air Force to learn to fly. In Apollo, all of pilots, all of the crew need to fly the thing at some point. And so that was the excuse for we learning to fly. And most of the people among our science group wanted to learn to fly. I sure did. But we were so afraid. And they were delaying sending us to flight school for some reason. We started there in the summer, and we didn't get sent to flight school until the following April, I think it was. So we were, during all that period, afraid they were going to cancel that. But we didn't dare say, gee, we want to go to flight school, because we really convinced the more we said that, the less likely they were to send us, because they were considering using flight school to wash us out. So we were like Brer Rabbit, don't throw us into the briar pit. That was sort of the attitude we took. And after Alan Shepard's introduction to the astronaut office, where he was telling us we were not needed, that was the period of the X-15 and all of this. And some of the pilots were actually previous X-15 pilots, or at least Joe Engle was.
Yeah.
And so every group gave themselves a name, like the Mercury astronauts, the Gemini astronauts, and so forth. So we gave ourselves the name, the XS11. And if you say it fast enough, you get the idea. Anyway, they finally did send us to flight school, and that was during Vietnam. And there were a lot of training schools because of all the pilots the Air Force needed, and they didn't want to send us as a group to any school because they were afraid as civilians we would distort the way the Air Force trained. So they sent us only one to a class, and we actually drew our assignments out of a hat. And I drew Laughlin Air Force Base in Del Rio, Texas, and thought, oh, gee, Randolph and San Antonio and Williams and Phoenix, those were the cherries, I guess. And I had picked the bramble, but it turned out, for me anyway, Del Rio was perfect.
Yeah.
There was nothing much to do there, so they actually declared it a hardship base, meaning that as civilians, we had access to the medical and the base, the shop kind of thing, whatever they call that. And because there was no place to go, the crew, our class, stayed together on weekends and had parties and picnics. And this was so unlike graduate school, where we were all working, and you might have had a couple of friends, but you didn't have much of a social life. And here, the work was fun. You flew half a day and we're in class half a day, and every week you'd switch. So one week you'd fly in the morning and class in the afternoon. The next week you'd be class in the morning and fly in the afternoon. And so two classes are going on at the same time, and the two classes alternate. Anyway, we became so close as a class that we're still part of an email group and communicate with each other. Most of the rest of them, of course, went to Vietnam. It was late in the war, so they all flew heavy airplanes over there, like most all, not everybody. Yeah. And then they came back and flew airliners, and then have now retired from that and are frustratingly conservative. But anyway, we still communicate in a friendly way on with our email list. Sure. So it was a great year, and many of us actually graduated first in our classes there, and but it did wipe. 3 of us washed out and left, so we were, and one just quit, so we were down to 7. 4 we lost over that period. We lost 4 people in our group, not through death or anything, but through leaving. Yeah.
Okay, interesting. And what was your reaction when you first learned that you'd be going to space?
When what now?
When you learned that you'd be going to space?
Oh,
Space Shuttle.
Well, it's about time.
You're like, finally,
yeah. I had thought I'd gotten I would get a ride on one of the earlier missions, and as I said, I think I opened my mouth once too often and discouraged because the commander has a lot to say about who his crew is, and it wasn't until the Space Lab 2 came along with a lot of science and Gordy Fullerton as the commander that I was invited to fly. So from the first flights were in 81, and excuse me, I didn't fly until the summer of 85, but it was a great flight, and I'm glad that's the one I got to fly on, because it was a great crew, and the science was great, and the problems were great, and the view was great. I had worked in Antarctica a couple of years while I was with the USGS, and so we were in a high inclination orbit in the middle of the summer, which meant that when we were farthest south, we could look over Antarctica, and the auroras are formed from charged particles coming around the Earth on the magnetosheath and coming up the tail end. So the aurora over Antarctica was most active. Yeah. And so it was standing up like a green curtain, and you could see waves in it. And we were flying in early August. And so the Perseid meteor shower was going on. So while I was looking at the at the curtain, the auroral curtain, I could see shooting stars below me. So,
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it was neat.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah. Jeez. And did you feel like the preparation that you had for space travel fit your experience when you finally got to space, or?
Oh yeah, the training at NASA was excellent, and I probably overtrained. I was compulsive about
Okay.
taking notes on. I had a notebook of because we were kind of responsible. We were controlling the science through the computer interfaces in the payload bay, and
Yeah.
we did. Story Musgrave and I were trained to go out and do EVAs if we needed to. We were kind of hoping something would break so we would need to, but they never did. So I didn't get to do an EVA. But I wanted to know how those systems worked rather than just have instructions for which buttons to push. So unlike the orbiter, where they had taught us how the structure of the systems, we didn't really know how. We weren't really taught the electrical structure of the payload. So I took it on myself to learn it myself. And I got the schematics and I'd made drawings in my notebook so that I actually knew more about the payload than the people on the ground.
Wow.
And they took copies of my notebook before I flew just so that we'd be able to talk on the same page. Also, we flew the second amateur radio experiment in space. Owen Garriott flew the first one on a shuttle flight. And he and I have been arguing for a long time that we ought to be flying amateur radio because it would be good publicity. And eventually when we got to longer missions, that kind of casual conversation between astronauts and the general public, rather than going through PR, would help a lot. So anyway, so Owen got to fly the first one, and he just did handy-talky discussion with people he could talk to around the world, just the way amateurs, like calling CQ and see who comes. We wanted to do ours in a more structured way. So we actually also had a slow scan TV, and we had arranged through amateur clubs in all of the NASA centers to encourage boys and girls science groups or whatever in the schools to write to us about their interest, their interest in the science we were doing, showing that they had really some interest. And then we would try to put them on a schedule. And because we couldn't do it during our 12-hour working hour, we'd have to do it in the off hour. Two other crewmen, Gordy Fullerton, the commander, and John Bartow, also, actually, Gordy had once started getting an amateur license, but never finished. And then Bartow didn't have a license, so that both of them got licenses so that we could operate the radio in the off shift around the clock if we wanted to.
Yeah.
And during the mission, I think there was something like 300 scheduled contacts with different people. Then also, the shuttle itself didn't have any way to get images on board. We could send images down, but the only uplink was through a teleprinter. And we were having all this trouble. We had flying a lot of new stuff, and the ground wanted to get some images up to us to help us understand what they wanted us to do. And they actually went to the amateur radio control center there, and mission control wasn't in mission control, it was in the public part, and actually set it up on the amateur radio so that they could get images on board. And they found that was so useful that they modified the shuttle to be able to send images up later. So once again, amateur radio led the way.
Interesting. Okay. And can you remind me, what was the primary goal of the mission that you were on in the space shuttle?
We were doing primarily solar astronomy and plasma physics. We had a little satellite that we deployed and fired electron guns in the plasma around the Earth, and looked at the dispersion of the propagating beam with this satellite that was called a plasma diagnostic package that was a few kilometers away. And then when we were done with the experiment, we flew up and picked up the satellite again and brought it home for future missions. And then we had the instrument pointing system, which was a very sensitive telescope pointing system that was built by Dornier in Germany. And a couple of us went over to Dornier for a couple of months before the flight to do the acceptance testing. So that satellite, that pointing system was so precise that it could point to a sun or the moon. The diameter in the sky is 1,800 arc seconds, a half a degree. And it could point to 1 arc second and hold it there while the shuttle maneuvered underneath the telescope. It had its own star trackers and the whole business. And then you had image motion compensation in the instruments on the star tracker that could get down to 1/100th of an arc second. And if you look through the Earth's atmosphere at the sun, 1 arc second is the best you can resolve just because of turbulence in the atmosphere. So here we were able to get 2 orders of magnitude better, understanding the dynamics of the processes on the surface of the sun. And we carried 4 telescopes on the instrument pointing system. Some were imaging, some were spectral telescopes, but for solar astronomers to better understand how the fusion processes were working on the sun.
Yeah. Wow. Okay. Yeah, that's really cool.
Yeah. It was another interesting experiment, which relates to amateur radio, although it was done for the defense. We had this electron beam gun that we could fire into the plasma. It turns out we also did an experiment which was secret at the time, but isn't anymore. We fired it a bunch of times and made a grating, a conducting grating, like wires hanging down, but it was really charged plasma. And then a signal was sent from the Earth that used the grating to reflect down to the station they wanted to get the signal to.
Oh, wow. Okay. That's cool. Jeez.
Yeah.
Yeah, you got to do all sorts of stuff then on that mission. Wow. So what were you thinking when you were getting ready for the space shuttle to lift off and you first entered it and you're getting ready for it to begin?
Let's go.
Let's go.
Remember, we went there 2 weeks before and the engine started and then 3 seconds before the solids were to start, the engine shut down. And so we all were released, and we had guests at the Cape, so we went with the guests to Disney World. And it was fun to stand in line for a ride or something and listen to other people who'd come to the launch speculating on what had gone wrong that forced us to shut down.
Right. Yeah, I'm sure that was interesting.
Yeah. So 2 weeks later, we got to try it again.
Okay.
This time, and until those solids light, you don't know whether you're really going.
Yeah, sure. And when you first reached outer space, what was that feeling like?
It was great. The view was fantastic. I could watch us go into as one book writes, go into the black as we were lofting.
Yeah.
And then, of course, when the engines all shut down and you floated forward in your seat, it was just great fun. I was lucky I didn't get space sick. A couple of our crew did. One of them even got space sick coming back down. But
oh my gosh.
Anyway, I was just lucky I didn't seem to have that problem. And so we had a lot of these new experiments, and because the IPS, that instrument pointing system, had never really been tested on the ground, it couldn't lift itself in 1G. It was all simulated, and it turns out the control system didn't work. It would lock onto the sun, and then it would start dithering around and then get bigger and bigger, and then finally go over and hit the stop. And so it took us several days of software patches to loading up to try to get it to work right before it did work right. And then we had some patches we had to put in the instruments that were in the bay. So a lot of the first few days were very hard work fixing things. And so we couldn't really spend much time looking out the window. It wasn't until I think day 3, the computers overheated. And so NASA wanted to turn them off for a few hours. The heat, the cooling system depends on those solar panels, that cooling panels that are out there. And if you're in a certain position, you don't get enough cooling, it gets too much sun on them. And that's what had happened. But anyway, so there wasn't much we could do during that period because all the instruments were controlled through the computer interface. So I took a big camera bag and tied it off around my waist and Velcroed it around the overhead window on the flight deck and just spent 2 orbits looking out the window. And it was beautiful. That's when I saw that stuff in Antarctica. And also when we came over North Dakota, it's 8 minutes from the West Coast to my hometown along the Cheyenne River in North Dakota. And you could pick out the rivers and things. And at night you could pick out the highways from the lights. Yeah. And at the same time, you're looking down on North Fargo. You could look south and see the Gulf of Mexico, and look east and see the Atlantic Ocean. And it wasn't like a map. You really can see the topography and the clouds, how the clouds are above the ground. Right. And so looking through just looking was a great deal of fun. And probably if I had known how much fun it was, I'd have cheated a little bit more during the mission and looked out the window.
Yeah, I understand. That's cool. Yeah. Wow. And is there kind of this weird pressure that you get like in your head when you first get into space?
Yeah, it's not weird. What it is your legs are part of the heart muscles, and they squeeze the blood into your torso area. Okay. And if you can get the same feeling if you hang by your knees upside down from a high bar, your head starts feeling like, Yeah. And that's what that is. Your body actually dumps, I've forgotten how many gallons of fluid during the first couple of days because it doesn't need it. Right. And then when you come back in, to keep from being faint, you're forced to drink, I think about a gallon. I've forgotten the exact numbers, but it's something like a gallon of this salty water. And it's not fun, but if you don't do it, you won't be able to stand up.
Wow. So that's when you come back, or?
Yeah, that's when you come down. Yeah, one of the pilots refused to do it, and he was actually faint while he was flying, and he was grounded after that. They kind of fired him.
Yeah. Wow. That's really interesting. Okay. Let's see. What were the regular interactions like between different astronauts in space?
What were the interactions like?
Yeah, between you and your colleagues in space.
Oh, this is one of the high points, because as I mentioned, some of the crews come down not very strong friends. Yeah. And our crew came down just absolutely. There was never a harsh word, as much pressure as we were under. I mean, you would be, your feet are in loops hooked on the floor so you don't float around, and you're sitting there working diligently on something, and somebody's got to reach between your legs to flip a switch down here, and somebody has to come over the top and get something up here. Yeah. And with all of that, there were many opportunities to give a harsh word, get the hell out of here. Never heard a harsh word. And everybody was completely supportive. And so it was just a wonderful example of how a crew works together. And I attribute this much to Gordy Fullerton because of his experience as a test pilot in heavy airplanes, where he had to trust crews and knew what he did during the training period is, when we were getting ready for launch, you noticed that he'd come around and watch what you were doing and listen to the trainers, the reports on how each crewman was doing, And essentially, he was certifying in his mind that we were competent to do our jobs. So when we got to orbit, he didn't micromanage, he let us do our jobs. And he drifted between the two shifts. We had, 7 people and 3 on one 12-hour shift and 3 on the other. And he was our zebra. His shirt was both, I think it's red and blue, or a color. We had the blue shift and the red shift, and he was red and blue. Anyway, he would drift between the two on whatever interested him, but he didn't micromanage. He didn't sit there and say, you should do this or you should do that. Yeah. And it really made everything work well.
Yeah. That makes sense. That's cool.
No, we stayed friends as a crew for years and years. It wasn't until he passed away, he got a stroke. He left after our flight to go back to Dryden to be a test pilot in heavy airplanes. He flew the B-52 and some of the other planes that were, dropped the rockets that go into space and all this. His comment was the time, there are too many PowerPoint displays between flights at NASA Houston. So actually what it was, I think, just like we were tired of the political environment at NASA, NASA Houston, and we both wanted to do the things that we enjoyed doing, and he enjoyed flying most. So that's what he wanted to do. And I enjoyed the science most, and that's what I wanted to do.
Yeah. Was there a fair amount of bureaucracy as well then at NASA?
The politics about the time we flew were just absurd. For some reason, the administration of NASA at Johnson didn't want payload specialists. Those were people who were not career astronauts. They were flying because they knew something special. We flew 2 payload specialists, Lauren Acton and John Bartow. They were solar astronomers. They had minimum training for the mission, just enough to be safe, but not career astronauts. And the administration tried to make their flights as miserable as possible. They told us if the instrument is a NASA instrument, you cannot let the payload specialist use it, touch it, or turn it on, or anything. They can only use their own instruments. Well, almost everything in the cockpit and the computers were NASA, because they controlled the experiments in the payload bay. And if that were true, and they couldn't even not even supposed to use the Hasselblad cameras. They couldn't take pictures out the window. They were supposed to tell us and point to what the picture was supposed to be, and we were supposed to take the pictures. And Gordy just said, this is nonsense, and trained the crew the way he thought they should be trained. And it worked just fine. But I think he burned some bridges in doing that. And that's one of the reasons he left. But all of the whole crew left after the mission because of these things. Roy Bridges Gordy went back to test flying. Roy Bridges, the pilot, went back to the Air Force and became a general before he retired, and then spent his retirement at Northrop Grumman, and now he's fully retired. Carl Henneis, the other scientist astronaut with me, he and I came on board at the same time. He was the oldest. He came on board at 43, and I came on board at 25. And he retired after that, but it was after leaving NASA, and he was a mountain climber, and so he wanted to be the first one at 65 years old to climb Everest. But he got the embolism up there and died up there, and he's buried on top. Yeah, he's buried on that upper base camp on Mount Everest. And John Bartow went back. Well, actually, he came back and kept working for NASA later, not as an astronaut, but as a flight manager. And but Gordy, Roy, I, and Carl all left NASA, and much of it, our last NASA Houston, and much of the reason we left is we just didn't like the environment, the political environment.
Sure, no, that's logical. I'm sure that would be frustrating for many people.
Yeah, and you reach an age in life where you want to get up in the morning and do what you think is important, and the university has been an environment where I can do that. it's something that, or when I was with USGS, I did that, and I guess it spoiled me. So when I went back to NASA, I really bridled under the control of, I was the first astronaut to have a computer on my desk, and it wasn't until 1983. When I left the university, or MIT in 1967, I had a computer on my desk.
Yeah.
It was a terminal that talked to a PDP, but it was a computer. And the astronaut office thought that we scientists wrote papers as, these are the words they use, that we scientists wrote papers as ego trips, that we just like to see our names in print. But they couldn't understand that a scientist's way of staying current and credible in his community is to publish credible papers.
Yeah.
And if we didn't do that, we wouldn't be respected as scientists. And so, and when I finally got a computer, the astronauts didn't pay for it. I had to get the science directorate to pay for it and loan it to me. And then the head of the astronaut at the time, which wasn't John Young, came into the office and said, and if I ever catch you playing games on it, it goes. That's what he thought I was wanted the thing for.
My gosh.
So it was not, it was not a friendly atmosphere for scientists. It's much better now, at least at a distance. Everything I've heard is that it is. So it was largely a product of the times, I think.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. Wow. So I guess thinking of some sort of big picture questions a little bit now, what would you say the public doesn't really understand about NASA and how it operates then?
I would say that the unmanned part, exploration part, comes out of JPL and Goddard and other places, can be explained through science arguments and justified more. They operate, their decision-making processes are much more in the open.
Okay.
The manned space flight is such a big thing in terms of dollars that it becomes very political, and not only political in the open sense, but political between the black world and NASA. What is NASA doing versus what NRO is doing, or whoever's flying secret satellites and stuff. So that's in there that you don't really see. And then the other thing you don't really see is the NASA centers don't get along. They try to compete and try to have all capability in case, each one is afraid that a cutback in budget will force that center to close, or that they won't get a significant piece of a new mission or something or other. I remember I was a program scientist for Space Station after the shuttle accident, and I didn't want to leave because it would look like rats leaving a sinking ship. So I wanted to hang around until I started flying and then leave. It wasn't to hang around to get another flight. So they made me program scientist for Space Station. Well, it wasn't a space station yet, but they were designing. And so many of the arguments had to do with which center had which responsibility for what. It was, one of the grossest one is one center had strengths in, I think I'm kind of making it up because I don't remember the details, had strengths in AC power. Another had strengths in DC power. And so when we were putting two modules together, they were actually bulk converting AC to DC every time they went across the interface. Now that was straightened out later. They really didn't do that, but that's what they were proposing doing. That kind of competition.
Wow. Okay.
They couldn't even agree on a power standard.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. What would you say is a common misconception about space travel?
I don't think people understand how difficult it is, both technically and as a how much we don't know on human management of humans in that environment.
Yeah.
And this is one of the reasons I'm so anxious that we get on with Mars program, because humans to Mars, because it will force us to start answering questions which need to be answered if in fact humans are ever really going to have a future in space, rather than as we do now. It's kind of like diving to the bottom of the ocean. We can do it, but we don't plan to stay there.
Right.
Now, we have to solve problems, the radiation environment. We have to solve problems of the microgravity environment. People that stay at the space station a year come down as basket cases. They've lost 15% of their bone mass, and it takes a while for their heart to recover enough that they can stand up. And we've tried treadmills and things. We actually had a treadmill on our shuttle. We were supposed to each spend 20 minutes on it a day. We said, yes, sir, we'll do that. Well, there's 7 crewmen, 20 minutes a day. And this thing, can you imagine pounding on a treadmill while you're trying to point a telescope that's sensitive to 1 arc second? Couldn't be done. So we said, yes, sir, and never took it out.
Oh my God. Yeah.
And but on an 8-day mission, you didn't need to. It was just
right. That's high risk.
It was part of the NASA harassment of our mission, I think.
Yeah. So I guess you see like the future of space travel to Mars and stuff as a big test.
A big test of whether humans will really ever. The first step of whether humans will ever really go off to some extent, that much like the early whalers did, where they might be gone 6 years before they return to their port. And that's a big difference on what we're doing now. And eventually, once you start doing that, then you can start thinking, well, there may be a large enough vehicle where they just don't come back. They're going on someplace else. But that's a long time in the future. The problems are much more, though, than just microgravity and a radiation environment. That there's an issue of human immune systems. If you, even in Antarctica, when you're down there and isolated for months at a time, you lose some of your resistance to disease. Every time we'd be back, finally go back into McMurdo, and a flight would come in and everybody would catch a cold. Well, it can get a lot worse than that, and you can become like the tribes, in Indonesia, that when the whatever you call the settlers, the people from the West came in and made everybody sick and died. So how do you maintain those kinds of immune system in a closed environment over years? We don't have anything equivalent to that now. And how do you do it? I'm not sure the doctors will know. So I just think there's a whole lot to learn before we know how. We're really adapted to this environment. We have bugs that we share in our gut that share with the environment. We have the bugs that make us immune to some of the things that are going on here. If any of these people came back after a few years, they might have a very hard time surviving.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting point. I don't think I've had someone bring it up from that perspective, but that's really interesting to think about. All the risks involved with coming back.
I think one of the biggest risks is that we're so adapted to this environment. Can we really adapt to that one and without cutting off access to this one?
Yeah, sure. That makes a lot of sense. How did your time with NASA and your time serving as an astronaut affect your family life?
It was pretty hard on it, to be truthful. The interim in Golden, Colorado, when I was with the USGS, was a very pleasant interlude where the family kind of reconstructed itself. But during Apollo, I was on travel something like I think 260 270 days a year. I would come to the astronaut office in the morning and take a T-38 someplace in the afternoon and not arrive back home until Saturday. Typically I'd fly to Los Angeles, land at Los Angeles International, and do acceptance testing of the command module for, say, Apollo 13 or Apollo 16. And because this is what the support crew did for 2 or 3 days. And then I'd fly across country to, what was the name of the airport? Anyway, out on Long Island where Grumman was, and do acceptance testing for the landing module. And by that time, when I was through with that, the crew who was doing most of their simulations in those days at the Cape rather than in Houston would fly back to Houston for the weekend. So I'd fly down to the Cape and get a day in the simulator there. It was the only time that I could get access to the simulator. And then Saturday night, fly home. And then Monday morning, start all over again. That was my typical week.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. That's pretty hectic.
Got a lot of flying in. I was allowed to fly 40 hours a month, and by golly, I got 40 hours every month. And if I didn't get it during normal wake, I could take it on the plane on weekends, and I'd just fly around the edge of the country, go to West Coast, up the coast of Washington, then across to North Dakota, and land in Fargo and spend the night Saturday night with my folks, and then Sunday fly back to Houston. It was kind of fun because the Air Guard in Fargo at that time, they called themselves the Happy Hooligans, were flying an old, I don't know, Republic something or other interceptor, which didn't have very good performance. The Republic saying about their airplanes, if longer runways are built, Republic will build airplanes that need them. Anyway, the T-38 was just a hot rod. And so they would ask for a burner climb just to see one. And it was a very long runway, I think 13,000 feet, because B-52s would do landings there for practice. And so I would get permission from Tower and air traffic control to do that, which wasn't, there wasn't much air traffic control up there then. So I would take off and suck up the gear and stay in ground effect all the way to the end of the runway. And by then I'm going over 500 knots. And then I could go straight up to 3,000 feet and do an Emmelman and head south.
Oh my gosh. Geez. Wow.
So cool. That was fun. Used a lot of fuel, but I'd refuel on the way back. I couldn't make it back to Houston after doing that.
Wow. Do you have any favorite stories as an astronaut?
I think I've shared.
Okay. No, that's good. Okay. Let's see. What would you say was your proudest moment as an astronaut?
I think the success of our shuttle flight.
Yeah.
And I remember, when the shuttle lands, they always say on the radio, and the crew is in there doing shutdown testing and all. Well, that's not what the crew's doing. The medics come on board and they're walking you back and forth on the middeck to get your sea legs so that you can come down the steps without falling. That's what's going on.
Don't want to look bad. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So anyway, I was sitting in a seat on the middeck, and the crew, the medics got up, came aboard, and I must have been looking sad or something. And what I was really thinking, well, gee, it's all over. That was really fun. And, it's too bad, it's sort of a once in a lifetime thing, because I had no intent of staying at NASA. But that, I guess, was coming down. And then we spent the night, we landed at Edwards because we didn't yet have the brakes and that parachute they used to land at the Cape.
Yeah.
And at Edwards, they could land on the playa, and had 22 miles to get stopped. And Gordy made a wonderful landing, much softer than most of the Braniff pilots, or the pilots that I fly commercially with. Anyway, so we immediately flew back to Houston and that night, and then spent most of the night talking with the scientists whose experiments we flew on how they had worked and what we'd seen. And that was just fun to share with them, because it was, I mean, they had spent years building those experiments and they really wanted to know how it went.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. That makes sense. See, what, in your opinion, is the most important work of NASA?
Technology advancement. It really is.
Yeah.
They call them space rocket scientists, but they're really rocket engineers.
Okay.
And that technology was supposed to, by the charter, be transferred to the private sector. And they should have done it a long time ago. And now they're doing it, or did it.
Mm-hmm.
And so SpaceX and others are coming along, moving the cost of getting to orbit way down and the safety way up. So NASA should be in the position of maybe not even developing all the technology themselves, but doing like they do with SpaceX, is essentially getting companies, private sector, to compete to do something better than's being done, and fund that competition. So that they do very well.
Okay. And so how have you seen then NASA sort of change over time?
Well, from a distance, and maybe it's just being at a distance, when I left NASA in '88, I never really went back to Houston. So I really don't. What I know of the environment there is what I read. Now, I've been in several National Academy reviews of how NASA is doing, but it didn't involve getting into the nitty gritty, like actually living there. Mm-hmm. I think it's much healthier than it used to be. The diversity is greater. The breadth of experience of its leaders is better. So I'm optimistic for what they can do. And actually, towards the end of the space station work and the end of the shuttle program, some of the science that was being done in orbit was actually very good science. That during most of the shuttle's history, most of the things that NASA claimed were science was not science, it was demonstrations. There were very, very few papers appeared in the science journals about from the results from the shuttle missions. And that was beginning to change towards the end of the shuttle program and into the space station program. So all those things are positives.
Yeah. And so you briefly mentioned, the emergence of companies like SpaceX. How do you see space travel changing over time?
Oh, I really like the idea of private interest to getting into space. I mean, that was what it was supposed to be all about.
Yeah.
NASA should not be exploring the moon for resources, but if there's a reason to explore the moon, then maybe that's a private sector investment. So I'm happy to see it all, even if it's just tourism.
Right. And do you feel like these companies like SpaceX and stuff, they're not as sort of limited by sort of the politics and stuff?
Yeah.
Then
they're looking for good ideas that make a profit, and that's great.
Yeah. Okay. Last couple questions here then. To what extent do you think being originally from Indiana sort of helped you develop as a person and become an astronaut?
Oh, I don't know. I'll tell you one thing though. Being from the Midwest, whether it's North Dakota or Indiana or Ohio or wherever, seems to grow, at least in those days, seems to grow kids who had ambitions for exploration in some sense. If you looked at the backgrounds of almost all the early astronauts, they were from the Midwest.
Yeah. That is interesting.
Yeah.
I guess maybe yeah, there's some interest. Maybe being in the Midwest, we are kind of isolated more than some of the other places. I guess you can.
Maybe I also think it has to do with being from smaller systems. You grow up, maybe that's just a hypothesis, feeling that more is possible. Being in a really big place, it's too easy to start feeling like there's somebody better. Or there's your imagination gets trampled on. Now maybe in the alternative to that is even in a big city like New York, you break into boroughs and you break into your groups where you might become a great basketball player and not feel that same kind of crushing feeling. But I really noticed the difference between when I was in Fargo. The junior high school I went to was a large one where we had a great band and orchestra, which I enjoyed, and had all the classes. But when I moved to West Fargo, it was a really small school with only, as I said, 54 people in a class. I enjoyed that much better because you didn't have to be that good to try different things. I mean, in the big schools, you're either a jock and you're not something else. In the little schools, you're both a jock and a scientist. So
yeah, no, that's I understand. That makes sense. Okay, last question then. What advice would you give to any cruisers that are striving to become an astronaut or work for NASA or SpaceX one day?
Do it as anytime you can, particularly do it as an intern in the summer. And they do take a lot of interns in the summer at all of the NASA centers. And I found that those summer jobs were really important. I mean, I had a summer job, as I said, starting when I was 12, when I worked on the farm. And then after that, I worked in lumber yards and as a carpenter and then a power line crew and all that. All of those things give you insight in how the world works, but also how you want to fit into it. And you've got to get those experiences if you're to make informed decisions. So that's the advice I have. And I always felt that you had to have a goal, even if you changed it monthly, because there's sort of a feeling, well, I'll sit on the mountaintop and something will come to me, and I don't believe that. I believe you go out and find the things you want to do.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Perfect. Well, thank you so much for doing this.
Okay.
I don't have any more questions for you. This has been really fantastic and interesting. So,
well, I hope so. Anyway, thanks for doing it.